Baccano has a lot going on. It's one of those stories that doesn't concern itself with good and evil, or right and wrong. The spectrum basically goes from undeniably evil to very questionable and finally to extremely grey. Depending on your morals, you might see that spectrum completely differently, but morality is something that the story distinctly doesn't engage with, favoring an objective presentation of each character's point of view instead. Framing itself in such a way, it makes its numerous characters and the way they see the world around them more interesting to observe and learn about, rather than judge and question. And because of that, among many other things, one might say that it's a story about selfishness. What's different about most of Baccano's characters is not that they're extremely selfish, is that they're unapologetically selfish. Each one of them has their own understanding of the world, which they apply indiscriminately towards everything. Even when their worlds intersect and clash, their selfishness doesn't budge in the slightest. And while some despicable and morally questionable characters operate under this mindset, it's made clear that it's not a bad thing by itself. Some characters' selfishness is destructive, while others become more altruistic because of it. But the one thing that almost all of them have in common is that they never stop staying true to themselves, which allows them to act with complete confidence in their actions. Jakuzi's plot is a gang leader that's almost always crying and being scared of everything that happens around him. His legs shake when he's in fear, and there's barely a moment in which he doesn't look like a nervous mess. But he always pushes past his weaknesses and manages to do what he thinks needs to be done. When he was a kid, his girlfriend accidentally blew her face up with a handmade explosive, which left her with a missing eye and a scarred face. Despite being a big crybaby, Jakuzi goes and gets a face tattoo that makes him similarly abnormal. During the course of the story, he faces off against many things that he's scared of, and yet he never backs down, even when he's scared enough to cry his eyes out. Lad Russo stands on the opposite side of the spectrum. He's a complete psychopath that slaughters people because he enjoys it, and while that type of insanity is despicable, that's who he is, and similarly to Jakuzi, he never betrays that part of himself, even in the face of extreme danger. My favorite examples of this might just be Isaac and Miria though. These two are always happy-go-lucky no matter what. They spend months mining for gold in a mine and never seem to lose their enthusiasm even when they realize that they haven't seen any gold yet. At one point they even end up at the scene of a gruesome murder and still can't fucking take it seriously. The happiness they derive from doing whatever they want, no matter how risky or retarded it may be, is shown to be irresistibly infectious for everybody they meet. They end up being a positive influence on so many people's lives, even though all they're really doing is living life the way they want to. All these characters have such a unique and insane point of view which they indiscriminately filter everything through, that it's almost like they're living in their own worlds. But when you think about it, that's what all of us are doing as well. I think that that's the underlying idea that runs through the whole story, but there is one character that outright states it. Enter Vino. He was an orphan that was taken in by a mafia family and eventually ended up in a circus. During the time that he was a performer there, he trained hard enough to obtain superhuman strength and dexterity, which he later used to his advantage as an assassin for the mafia. In the penultimate episode, while standing on top of a train and covered in the blood of his victims, he speaks about his life philosophy. According to him, the world is his, because he can only be sure of the existence of his own consciousness. And so, if he ceases to exist, then everybody else will too. This is essentially true for every single one of us. The only reason that we can even be aware of each other's existence is the fact that our own personal point of view exists in the first place. Everything begins and ends with ourselves, and that's something that we'll never be able to deny. People seem to be generally against accepting that idea because of some of its seemingly negative implications, but those aren't really based in reality. Towards the beginning of the story, Vino's friend Tony gets killed by the White Suit Gang, which is led by Lad Russo. Vino ends up humiliating him in a fight later on and almost says that this is Lad's atonement for Tony's death, before correcting himself and saying that this is Lad's atonement towards his world in which Tony no longer exists. This scene gets at the idea that even when we're seemingly doing something for someone else, the fact may be that we're still doing it for the benefit of our own world, and there's no need to hide from that. If Baccano was more generic, the dialogue here would have Vino saying that he's doing this for Tony, and while Vino almost says that he is, he actually ends up acknowledging the truth, which is that doing this quote-unquote for Tony actually brings satisfaction to Vino himself and directly benefits his own world, because if he didn't do this, he might have ended up regretting it later, which would negatively impact his world by making him experience negative emotions. That's what the calculation behind our actions looks like. Because we often delude ourselves about what we actually want, this calculation might end up being wrong. In that, a seemingly beneficial action might end up hurting and doing nothing for us instead. But while that happens sometimes, it doesn't change the fact that we're always attempting to make decisions that serve ourselves in some direct or indirect way. The idea that when a person close to us dies, it's specifically our own world that loses them is also pretty interesting, since our awareness of other people is directly tied to the fact of our own point of view's existence. When a person that has never appeared in our perspective dies, our world isn't and can't be affected by it as long as we remain unaware of that person's existence. When somebody that we're aware of but aren't that close to dies, we can be affected by it to a certain extent, but that will never compare to how we can be affected by the death of a close one, because the loss that our world suffers then is much larger. We lose out on every emotion that they made us feel and every single way their presence affected us. It might seem a little infuriating to say that it's the loss of these things that actually makes us fear and mourn the death of the people we love, but the implication of the inherent existence of such extreme selfishness in each one of us isn't necessarily a negative one. The most possibly infuriating conclusion here might be that humans operate under an unconscious and transactional mindset, but that doesn't need to be painted in a negative light as well. In episode 15, one of the characters called Shanae Laforet gets kidnapped, and Jacuzzi, thinking of her as a friend already even though they met quite recently, decides to sacrifice himself so he can save her. There doesn't seem to be any transaction here at first, but if you think about who Jacuzzi is as a character, then we can easily come up with one. He gains the peace of mind that comes with saving his friend and avoids the feelings of regret that he would experience if he didn't do it. Every such seemingly selfless action can be denied as selflessness with an explanation similar to this one, but that can never take away the results of that action. The individual worlds we live in can complement and enrich each other when we allow them to get bigger by sharing parts of them with others. And as long as your selfishness isn't needlessly and unjustifiably destructive, staying true to yourself will only improve those effects. If it is that unreasonably destructive though, and staying true to it really makes you happy somehow, then don't be surprised if somebody forces you to jump off a train at some point. To expand on this even further, I'd say that Baccano goes as far as to suggest that selfishness is a requirement for happiness. Shanae Laforet is completely devoted to her father and is willing to do anything for him. Her dad shares the secret to immortality with her and she decides to allow him to take her vocal cords out, so she never even has the chance to share it with anyone else. While Shanae's father was overjoyed by her self-sacrificing actions, that never seemed to make her happy. Also, since her father is the only person that's been somewhat decent to her and is basically her whole world, she fiercely protects it and doesn't let anyone in. At one point, Vino comes along and proposes to her about 15 minutes after they meet though. I fucking love this character. He knows about her father's immortality, but says that he doesn't care about it and promises to protect that secret with her. From her point of view, trusting Vino could end up threatening her father, and so it would be better to just ignore him. It's clear that the world she's been living in doesn't make her happy though, and after realizing that letting Vino into it could end up changing that, she lets herself become more selfish and ends up trusting him. The idea here is that you can never be happy unless you listen to your true desires. Even if your actions help the people around you and make them happy, if they don't match up with what you actually want to do, then your world won't be one in which you can be happy in. Now, let's talk about the anime's other qualities. I'd say that the selfishness of Baccano's characters is even reflected in its structure. They're all the main characters in their own stories, and the chaotic presentation of the narrative seems to agree with that. It constantly jumps between them in each episode and tells the story in a very non-linear fashion. The usual method of having the viewer mostly follow one main character and their friends through their mostly linear adventure makes it easier for the viewer to get immersed in their story, but Baccano doesn't want you to see the world through just one perspective. All of the incidents throughout the story happen because a group of wildly different yet equally selfish people's worlds intersect. The events of those incidents are then filtered through their subjective point of view, and the only way to get a full picture of such a situation is to try to follow and understand all of them. Being true to your inner self is a good thing, but that doesn't mean that you should stop expanding your world and always remain the same. Baccano challenges you to follow all these different people and expand your world at a rapid pace, which makes watching it a very active experience. That might prove to be an issue for some people, as it can easily lead to confusion if you aren't paying attention, but for anyone who's ready to patiently wait until they can match and understand the pieces of this chaotic puzzle, this shit is pretty much perfect for you. I'd also really recommend a rewatch for this one. In terms of deriving more meaning from it, you might come out a bit empty-handed, as it's certainly not that deep. Coming back to it to appreciate its structure and connect all the dots is much more enjoyable though. There's also enough foreshadowing here to make you scoff at yourself for not realizing what's going on from way earlier. Look at this guy trying to perpetuate his own legend. What a fucking dumbass. One problem that you might have with Baccano is that it does feel a bit unfinished in some ways, and that's probably because it only adapts about 4 volumes of a currently 22 volume long light novel. The people that worked on the anime obviously shouldn't be blamed for that, but the fact is that introducing some characters in the anime who only end up getting explored further in the light novels weighs it down a bit. The extra 3 episodes released about a year after the anime's original run suffer from this especially. They address some important questions that were left unanswered by the original 13 episodes, and do a really good job at developing a small number of characters a bit further, but they also dedicate a lot of their our available time to Graham Spectre, who is a cool character that sadly ends up doing pretty much nothing. When it comes to him specifically, these 3 episodes feel like a long introduction to a character who's gonna play an actual role in the story later on, but the anime stops before he gets to do that, which makes him and his goons feel like nothing more than a plot device. This is especially bad for a story that is so focused on the idea that everybody is essentially the main character, as Graham barely feels like a character. Because of this, and because of almost every other scene in these episodes serving as something like an epilogue, they also end up being much less exciting in retrospect. While not up to par with the original episodes, they are still good enough though, so I wouldn't say that the anime would have been better off without them. Finally, I wanna say that the music is really good. Jazz soundtracks in my anime make me fucking hard.